The biggest IKEA store in the world is actually not in Sweden. It's in Manilla in the Philippines. And the second biggest IKEA is in South Korea. But the third biggest IKEA in the world can be found in Stockholm, and that's where I'm going today. IKEA is one of the most famous brands in the world. And if you didn't know that IKEA comes from Sweden, well, then you've learned something new today. These days, IKEA is known all over the world for having cheap and pretty decent furniture. But that's not how it all started. On July 28, 1943, a strapping young lad called Ingvar Kamprad registered IKEA as a trading company, through which he imported things like pens, watches, and nylon stockings. That was in a small village close to the town of Älmhult in Sweden. More precisely, in the village of Älmtaryd. Älmhult is a small town, but Älmtaryd is even smaller. Close to Älmtaryd, you find another village called Agunnaryd, which has a couple of hundreds of inhabitants. Älmtaryd is even smaller than that. I couldn't even find a number for how many people live in that tiny microscopic village. Now, why am I talking about all of these small villages in the south of Sweden? Well, that's because those villages are part of the name IKEA. The name IKEA is an acronym for Ingvar Kamprad Älmtaryd Agunnaryd. It's basically the address where he lived back in 1943. Ingvar Kamprad was 17 years old when he founded IKEA, and he was 91 when he died in 2018. He was one of the wealthiest people in the world, and he was also one of the stingiest people in the world. It's said that he drove long distances to find bargain prices on potatoes, and that he usually ate lunch at IKEA stores before noon because you got free coffee before noon. In 2010, he was estimated as the 11th richest person in the world with a net worth of $23 billion. But then he fell to place 162 after some lawyers claimed that a foundation he created in Liechtenstein was the real owner of IKEA. But then he was estimated to be the 5th richest person in the world in 2015 with a net worth of more than $58 billion. However, another list in the same year estimated his net worth to be $3.5 billion instead. Regardless of what his actual net worth was, he was still immensely rich. The county of Småland in Sweden, where Ingvar came from, is infamous for having stubborn and stingy people, and Ingvar Kamprad completely embodied that stereotype. IKEA as we know it today, the furniture store that we all love or hate, started with a single store in the town of Älmhult in 1958. The second IKEA store that ever opened was this one, IKEA Kungens Kurva, in 1965 in the southern part of Stockholm. The name Kungens Kurva is pretty interesting, by the way. It means the King's Bend in English, and it refers to a royal car crash back in 1946. Gustav V, our current king's grandfather, was king back then, and he was traveling back to Stockholm after a hunting trip at Tullgarn Castle. The car was traveling at a frightening speed of 65 kilometers per hour when the driver suddenly lost control at an unsafe right-hand bend in the road. The road was rebuilt after that, and in 1953, 2 gas stations opened at the side of the road, and they named their stations the King's Bend in memory of the accident. Long story short, that eventually became the official name of this area, so when IKEA opened the store here in 1965, that became IKEA Kungens Kurva. This store used to be the biggest IKEA in the world until the Asians stole both the first and second place, with stores in the Philippines and in South Korea that are both bigger than this one. This store is 63,000 square meters compared to 68,000 square meters for the one in Manilla. It's still a huge and labyrinth-like store. I wouldn't be surprised to find a lost tribe of people here who have made this their new home, among couches and cutlery. I bet that you all know about the funny-sounding IKEA product names, but did you know that they're all Scandinavian words and that there's a system behind it all? All bathroom items are named after Swedish lakes and rivers and other bodies of water. Fabrics and curtains have female names, and desks and chairs have male names. Rugs are named after places in Denmark, which is fitting because you can stomp on them and rub your dirty feet on them. Closets and beds are named after places in Norway, and bed linen are named after flowers and plants. And so on. It's a pretty detailed and intricate system. Or at least that used to be the case, but since IKEA has thousands and thousands of different products, naming things has become more and more difficult. There's still a system, but it's filled with exceptions these days. Take bookshelves, for example. Bookshelves are named after occupations and male names, like Billy the bookshelf. But now there's also a bookshelf called Kallax, after a place up north in Sweden. And there's also a bunch of names that are obviously just trolling. Ekorre means squirrel in Swedish, and it's also the name of a children's rocking moose. A good example of good old, weird Swedish humor. Hemnes, that's a place in Norway, I think. Mackapär, that's a Swedish word for a thingamajig. Murvel is an old slang term for a journalist. Makes perfect sense, right? The octopus is called blåvinge, blue wing. I'm starting to think that all the children's products have troll names. Tjusig means handsome. That could be another troll name. The shoehorn is called snöskyffel. Can you guess what that means in Swedish? Snow shovel. A scented candle called adlad, knighted. Well, why not? The names of IKEA products can be stupidly simple sometimes. These pens are called måla, which means to paint. These baskets are called gnabbas, which means to bicker, and that makes perfect sense. If the kids are bickering, just smack them on the side of the head and put them in the basket until they learn to behave. I hope I'm not the only one who loves these pandas and pigs. They're absolutely adorable. Ever since 1958, IKEA stores have been serving food. You can always find Swedish meatballs at every store, but also some local specialties. In the US, you can get chicken tenders and waffles with bacon, for example. In Japan, they serve curry and seafood, and in Canada, you can get poutine. In India, you can get biryani, and in the Middle East, you can get shawarma. I'd love to say that the third biggest IKEA store in the world has a lot of exotic Swedish food, but it doesn't. Here, you can get regular old pork schnitzels with béarnaise sauce. Swedes love béarnaise, by the way. It's like their ranch dressing. And there's some chicken and fish and salads, but overall it's pretty boring. There's a bit of Swedish fika though, with proper Swedish cinnamon buns. And by that I mean that it's not those weird American so-called cinnamon buns covered in white gunk. Either way, IKEA food isn't supposed to be an exquisite culinary experience. It's supposed to be cheap and filling, perfect for when you're shopping with hungry kids or a hungry spouse. The IKEA food market isn't all that interesting for a Swede. I mean, for us it's just food, although a bit cheaper. But I guess that it's more interesting for a foreigner. Ironically enough, Swedish fish isn't sold in Sweden, so IKEA is one of the few places where you can get it here. Or well, I mean, we do eat it, but as part of lösgodis, not in bags like this. You can get a hot dog for 5 Swedish crowns at IKEA. That's literally impossible to beat. But for the Swedes out there, which one do you think is best, IKEA hot dog or Biltema korv? IKEA has changed since 1943. Sweden used to be a poor country in the first half of the 20th century, but things changed in the 1950s. Sweden's economy flourished, and people could spend more money on frivolous things, like furniture. The economic boom continued in the 1960s, and Sweden's standard of living continued to improve even more. More people wanted to buy things from IKEA stores, and IKEA also invested in new innovations, like exciting new fabrics and new types of products. The first IKEA store outside of Sweden opened in Norway at that time, and IKEA also expanded into the rest of Europe in the 1970s. They also tried to establish themselves in Japan at the same time, with mixed success. The Japanese liked the IKEA designs, but the products weren't exactly designed for Japanese living conditions. People lived in small apartments, and the huge IKEA furniture simply didn't fit very well. In 1986, IKEA stopped doing business in Japan, and they wouldn't return there until the 2000s. They did, however, expand into large parts of Europe, North America, many other Asian countries, and just about everywhere else in the world. By now, there are 462 different IKEA stores around the globe in 59 different countries. And more countries will come. New Zealand in 2025, for example, and Peru in 2026. There seems to be no stopping the giant that IKEA is today. Every IKEA product hasn't been a success. One example was in 1968, when they, for some reason, decided that selling pianos sounded like a good idea. That sounds like a really bad idea, because it was a really bad idea. Pianos are big and heavy, and you can't assemble them by yourself, which is basically the complete opposite of everything IKEA stands for. Another flop was in the 1970s, when IKEA took inspiration from the car industry and wanted to make chairs and couches from a simple metal mesh covered with fabric. The fabric turned out to be poorly designed and hard to put on, so 40,000 Tullarnäs chairs and couches ended up being scrapped. In the 1990s, there was another pretty insane failure. Environmental concerns became a hot topic during the 90s, and IKEA wanted to do their bit to help save the environment. They designed a couch called Reno, where people could keep a compost inside their living room and sit on it. Where to start with this one? First of all, the smell. You basically had food and leftovers rotting underneath your butt. And you also had to spend a lot of time adding shredded newspapers and other things to soak up the moisture. Oh, and then you were expected to add earthworms as well. In your couch, in your living room that you were sitting on. That didn't really work out as expected. Or I should say that it worked out exactly as well as you could expect. It was a complete flop. No, this isn't the warehouse from Indiana Jones. This is the self-service area at IKEA. There's free cookies at IKEA as well, so people keep their strength up and can shop even more. The idea for this video came from Richest, who sent me some really cool suggestions. He suggested that I have a look at some typical Swedish places like IKEA and a Volvo factory. The Volvo factory will have to come later, but I think it's a good idea for the next time I go to Gothenburg. If you have some other ideas for things you'd like to see from Sweden, please let me know. Leave a comment, or let me know in the 3-star Vagabond Facebook group, or just send an email. I appreciate it either way. And that's about it for this little look at the third biggest IKEA store in the world, and the second one that was ever opened. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day. Now have a look at this video up here in the corner for even more strange information about Sweden.